We're excited to kick off our next panel on overcoming high CapEx and long horizon to market maturity. The panel will be moderated by Scott Amyx. Joining us on the panel are Terry Virts, retired NASA astronaut, International Space Station commander, and colonel in the United States Air Force. William Pomerantz, Vice President of Special Projects at Virgin Orbit. Per Wimmer, founder of Wimmer Family Office. Sam Korus, analyst at ARC Investment Management. Matt Kozlov, managing director at Techstars, Starburst Space Accelerator. Please help me welcome our panelists. I'll let Scott take it from here.
Let's go ahead and get started. And thank you very much for everyone that's participating. So as most of you have heard from Dylan's keynote earlier, I wonder what are your thoughts in terms of how do we address the space industry given some of the challenges and kind of the uniqueness of this industry relative to other sectors?
One of the thoughts I have on that, obviously there's high CapEx required in space and it takes a long time for projects and businesses to mature. I think the government can have an important role there. Obviously NASA for the last 15 years has been providing a lot of seed money. Elon is pretty explicit in talking about how NASA saved his bacon. They were, one day away from bankruptcy, and he got the contract back in the 2000s. Really, that began with Mike Griffin starting the commercial resupply contract, and Jim Bridenstine has continued that with one example is the moon landers. I think there were 9 contracts given out for moon landers. But if the government can get involved in an area where, you kind of need that bridge between having a startup idea and actually getting to a profitable company, that's one way to do it, is with NASA seed funding.
Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just say from the public market perspective, I think we're starting to see, especially in this environment, people willing to take longer term viewpoint, especially given the kind of macro environment right now where interest rates are low. People have kind of extended their time horizon. And I think, that still applies to CapEx heavy businesses. We've seen that, with the auto space. I think when people see a large market opportunity, as long as they can understand the way that they get there, the public market's looking more and more open to these kind of business models.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Sam. Anyone else?
Hi, everyone. This is Will Pomerantz. Thank you so much for having me. I agree with everything that's been said. I'd also like to add, to me, one of the most exciting trends of the last 10 or 15 years in the aerospace industry is that we've started to have at least some business types that don't have such high capital requirements, at least up front. Particularly in the small satellite sector, we've seen a lot of really exciting businesses start off the strength of a friends and family fund or of a $20 million Series A or whatever it is, and to take that not to a preliminary design review and a set of PowerPoint charts, which is what it always used to be you'd get for that amount of money, but to get that actually to functioning satellites in orbit and results delivered to customers and starting to be able to bootstrap or at least at a minimum show proof of concept before you go back for these larger tranches. So I think that's been exciting because it's brought a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy into the industry, whether that's from the investment community or that's from talent coming into the industry from other industries. It's helped us keep a lot of the brightest young people, instead of going to work for Facebook or an online dating site, it's helped them keep them in our aerospace industry, which is so important to us. And then even at the national level, I think it's allowed nations that were previously not spacefaring nations to dip their toe into the pool to check the water rather than to plunge in head first, because they no longer need to devote, billions of dollars per year to have a functioning space program. They can do it on tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and that's much more appealing. I think that's one big reason why we've seen such incredible growth in the number of civil space agencies in the world, which was, a couple dozen a few years ago and sits at about 80 these days.
And since Lisa's still with us, I want to ask you, Lisa, as well, what are your thoughts in terms of space and how do you rationalize how to invest in space?
What is the last part of the question?
Yeah, so basically your approach and thesis to investing in space.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, Hemisphere is a frontier technology VC. We are looking for synergies across the space sector, and it's companies that can achieve an early revenue and prove that they are sustainable long term, and that's hard to do in the space sector, very hard to do. So we certainly set a high bar, but it's really the business model. I mean, we're investors. We look at the strategic plan for the company, and it can't just be the technology, right? It has to be how the customer is going to come in, at what point can the company achieve early revenues. And certainly the Air Force program has been an exceptional boost to early stage companies with their ability to prove traction when they win Air Force awards. And we work closely with AF Ventures to try and help, grow that program further for space in particular. But we're looking for companies that are going to be category creators. And by that, we're not talking about first movers. That's a little different. A category creator is a company that's going to be building an entirely new marketplace. So it's not we're going to build a rocket that's better than any other rocket. That's already been done, right? So you've got to find a new category. And there's so many opportunities. It's really limitless in the space sector, but you need the creative business plan. So that's what we're looking at. Not just a great plan, but a platform as well, so that there's a business that's going to be built out further into creating other potential vertical marketplaces. So a diversity of a customer base is important to us.
That's fantastic, Lisa. And then remind me to bring up one of the startups that's going to be featured in just a few minutes, who's focusing on lunar data. Matt, I wanted to give you an opportunity to get your thoughts around, how are you kind of rationalizing the aerospace?
Yeah, thanks for welcoming me. I'm Matt Kozlov. I'm the managing director of the Techstars Starburst space program, which we run in partnership with the United States Air Force, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, Lockheed Martin, SAIC, Aero Electronics, and IAI. We started this program about 2.5 years ago. We're going into our third program, this cohort, accepting applications now. And the goal was really to create an ecosystem that brings together leaders in commercial, civil, and military space, all around this very deep dive mentorship driven program that crams 2 years of growth and business development into a very short amount of time. And we actually have a very nice representation of our mentors actually in this meeting today. How we source companies is taking companies that are maybe relatively early in their corporate life. They're usually seed stage, 4 to 6 employees, really strong technical backgrounds and a lot of potential, but maybe early on the commercialization front. And we try to surround them with grants, investment capital, and really great industry experts to help them along their journey and go as fast as possible. And that includes working with the Air Force and the AF Ventures team and the AFWorks team, as well as working with NASA and corporates. And so far the results have been very strong, and we've had really great traction getting follow-up funding and getting onto phase 2s and meaningful contracts with our government partners as well. So that mentorship approach is really how we focus, and that's going to pretty much stay core to how Techstars invests.
So one of the things I'm really excited about this panel is that we have at a very early stage Matt, who is overseeing pre-seed, very early stage incubation, acceleration startups. And then you have Lisa that's working on more growth stage. And then Sam, who's working on secondary markets. And then William, who's actually working on the real projects. And then Terry, who's actually been to ISS. So I want to kind of go in that kind of a life cycle, starting with Matt, then Lisa, then Sam. And then William and Terry, from your perspectives of kind of, as you think about what's most important in the respective stages of the commercialization as well as investing, as well as some of the unique challenges within those stages that I'm talking about.
sequentially, I guess that would start with me. And so at the seed stage, really the number one asset you're investing in is the team. You're really looking for extraordinary people with not only the technical background to accomplish what they're trying to do, but the drive, the grit, the coachability, the humility, to make it in an incredibly difficult industry. And frankly, startups are already hard, and you're putting that on top of a unforgiving technical environment. So you really need an exceptionally strong team. And we, our philosophy is that an A+ team will take a C- product and turn it into a successful venture. But really, they need to be nimble, they need to be coachable, they need to be able to take feedback, they need to adapt to challenging circumstances, and frankly, come out of the challenging moments stronger for it.
Sorry, it all starts with the team. We do look for more mature founders in the space sector because this is a really difficult sector. It's very different from others. There's so much that's knowledge that's needed to really gain traction on so many levels. It's not just about the technology, but to gain traction, it's your ability to be networked, to get great advisors, to get capital. A lot of early stage entrepreneurs aren't so savvy on the fundraising side, which is really, really challenging because there are not a lot of VCs that invest in space. So they have to look at other opportunities, certainly in family offices and things like that when you're really early on. We're seeing some opportunities as well that we share with early stage companies in terms of financing, where if they're going to be getting contracts, there's some creative financing opportunities. So we want them to be considering to be operating on all fronts. It's really a high bar in the sector because you as well need to have knowledge of the legislative side of things. So, and in terms of the life cycle, you were asking about the life cycle question. Every company, no matter what sector you're in, I think you have to say what you're going to do and do what you say. And that's what investors look for in terms of the strength of a company is they plan to do X and they did it. That shows that certainty and strength of the team. And the more you can do that, I think the more you have the confidence of the investors grow over time.
I love that. Thank you so much for that, Lisa. Fantastic. Sam, so as these companies eventually make it to IPO and SPAC and get into your world, what do you look for?
Sure. So definitely, team still matters at this point. But one of the big things is just sizing the market. A lot of times we can see companies that make it to the public market that have, very interesting technology, but that doesn't necessarily mean that technology is useful in a huge market opportunity. So really seeing what that end state could be, and then really diving into the technology. And a lot of times, especially with disruptive innovation companies, you'll see those high costs early, but tracking to see what the end state unit economics look like. So what are the costs now, and how do those come down over time, and do they hit a inflection point where all of a sudden it can start to see rapid adoption as opposed to kind of one-off here and there in special circumstances.
Really enjoying these perspectives. And then William, can you talk about, so let's say they made it to public market, now they're really doing some serious work like the work that you guys are doing. What are you guys held accountable for, and what's important to you guys?
Well, I'll certainly echo everyone else's comments about the value of team, not just hiring the right ones, but as others have mentioned, retaining them, training them, keeping them engaged. Aerospace engineers are not always the easiest audience. I can say both as someone who manages them and someone who's married to one. It takes a lot to keep them they want to be informed about everything, and they want to feel engaged about everything. They want to feel empowered about everything, and that takes a really continual effort. For me, as I look at companies really at all these phases, the other big thing in addition to team that's important, and where I think the space community didn't do very well until relatively recently, is even kind of the simple basic business school 101 kind of stuff of product market fit. This is an industry that for the first 50 years of its existence was a monopsony. There was only one customer. It was the federal government of whatever nation you were in. And thinking about product market fit when you have only one customer who is also your partner, who is also your investor, who is also your everything, it has trained a lot of the industry to think in one way. Now, as we still have a thriving government sector, it hasn't gone away, it's gotten bigger, but we also now have this exciting venture-backed and everything else, all these other kind of fields, entrepreneurial fields. They're the ones who I think really need to come in and think about that product market fit and with a really, really close attention to it. We've seen a lot of space innovators over the years who come up from the engineering background and they invented a new widget and they're so excited about their widget and they have an engineer sense of pride about it. And they just say, well, I'll follow the leader on what everyone else is doing but I'll do it cheaper or I'll do it faster. I really go back to, I resonate with what Lisa said very much. A lot of people will just say, everyone else builds rockets, I build a better rocket. Everyone else builds imagers, I build a better imager. And that can work sometimes, but that's a pretty different thing from defining a new category, as Lisa was talking about. So finding the right founders, the right founding teams, the right board member teams, the right everything else that can help guide people to, no, you don't just need to do the same thing. Either look at doing a totally different thing within this sector or moving into a whole new category. That's where I get really, really excited.
Very, very nice. And thank you for echoing that. And Terry Virts, and then after Terry, I'm told that Per is with us as well. If you can speak up, that'd be great. Go ahead, Terry, please.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess my perspective would be once the product is in space and, by that point, it just needs to work and it needs to be reliable and it needs to survive in this extreme environment of space. From the ISS point of view, it has to be integrated well with people. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you get complicated things that don't make sense. And so I think when you go back to the early stages, you have to design these products with how is it going to be used? And I had a test pilot background before I was an astronaut, and you really need to test things operationally. I have some experiences from my time at NASA where we didn't test stuff. And for example, I installed the cupola on Node 3, and they sat next to each other at the Kennedy Space Center for about a year. And I went down there to test some stuff on a Node 3 simulator, and they didn't fit. And I said, hey, if it doesn't fit on the sim, let's try it on the real thing. And they said, well, we don't have time or money to test it. You can just put it together in space, which seemed crazy because they had a year. But anyway, a year later, I'm in space and we tried to put the cupola, we tried to put this stuff together and it didn't fit. And, it ended up barely, excuse me, this is not COVID, it's an allergy. It ended up barely fitting, but the lesson learned was you can't skimp on testing, and you need to test things and get them ready for the operational environment, which is can be much different than the early stages of a product or a company. So test things and don't skimp on testing. I guess that's my lesson.
All right, so I think you saw a lot of the panelists kind of smiling there. We're going to come back to testing because I think that's an important part. Per, are you with us? Are you able to speak? All right, so when you're able to, that's great, but we'll go ahead and continue. So on the topic of testing, so from the perspective of the startups, the challenge that they have is this heritage flight, the ability to actually send things to flight, right? So there's costs and various kind of factors that needs to be in place. And then proper testing, to the point of Terry. How can startups address some of these issues?
So I think the most important, it's like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Your first step is admitting you have a problem. So the first step is admitting that you need to do this, right? And understanding that this idea that you have, the engineer is very proud of this idea, but you have to think a few steps in the future, and how is this satellite or device that's going on the station or whatever, how's that going to fit into the big picture, and start designing from the earliest stages, and then take a build up approach. You often don't just build the biggest thing. I'm working with a drone company, and their goal is to build human taxi drones, but they're going to start with a quarter scale and then a half scale. And so that build up approach is another thing that you can do to minimize risk and get yourself to where you want to go.
Any other comments?
Well, I think in space, everything is about risk reduction, and a lot of investors don't necessarily understand that the risk reduction focus is an innate part of space companies. And as you test and you think about testing, companies are insuring what they do as well. So there's literal insurance, right, to handle any failures. So there's an extreme amount of focus on building in margin and looking at all ways of doing things to achieve success. So any great space company is working in that way.
I would add to that is the costs seem to be coming down as well to be getting that flight heritage. One of our portfolio companies, and I think Lisa knows them well, is a company called Orbit Fab, and they got a component of their overall system aboard the International Space Station for testing in with mid six-figure funding to get to that point. And so we have companies who are building satellites and they're not very expensive, and they're booking ride share to get into orbit fairly fast, and they're not going to put all 24 up with that level of testing, but they can get their first satellite up and then learn and then build on that. And the other component there is if you have a strong customer partnership, often the Air Force or NASA will help fund some of that R&D and help you get into orbit to get that TRL higher as well, which is generally a good sign of product market fit too.
And I would say we recommend some companies aren't entirely operating in a vacuum, and when they've got something so serious and they're heading toward the finish line, that they bring in outside parties for an external review. That's so important to get the outside opinion. What might we have missed along the way?
Great points. Thank you for that, Matt, Lisa. I want to ask in terms of these, let's call it more family offices, institutionals. I think there was an article maybe a few weeks ago. He's a prominent Wall Street analyst, and he was saying really kind of, undermining, I guess, things like astro mining and kind of these new categories that we're talking about. I still think there's quite a bit of education and information that needs to be more symmetrical so that the institutional side and the family office side can properly evaluate the opportunities in space. How do you go about informing your LPs, your shareholders, stakeholders around some of these opportunities when they themselves may be not super familiar, or they believe that it's 20, 30 years out and this is all fantasy?
It's a challenge. I think that to be in the space sector, one of your skills is you have to be a fantastic communicator. You have to be able to relate. How can you help someone that's not knowledgeable about the sector understand the value of it? So we definitely like to give the bird's eye view. It's fascinating. I've been on some calls lately where there are space companies that don't even talk about their technology. They're talking about the outcomes of it. And that's interesting to me, because that is what investors want to know in terms of the outcomes of if it's a company that, let's say it's in the ag space and they can reduce the amount of water required on a field, or they can, there's some environmental impact, then we're seeing companies that are in the space sector position themselves as ESG impact related, because space is good for the planet. Typically, you are working with clean technologies if you have solar panels and that type of thing. So I do find that approach fascinating, and actually have been exploring that angle with people from the ESG community, because it personally hadn't occurred to me, because we think about space as space, but other investors are interested in environmental impacts. And a lot of what we do in the space sector is protecting the Earth and helping change the ways that we can work with agriculture or the data that we bring back can be very useful in if that's what the company's working on in terms of Earth observation.
Great. William, I want to go to you in terms of if you could, again, because you have a different perspective, right? So you're in operation, you're in scaling. Give us a little perspective that you can share in terms of what are the big challenges and what are the key milestones that you guys are looking to hit. And I know we read a lot about SpaceX, but what's really happening and how well positioned do you think some of these rocket companies are relative to each other?
Yeah, well, one thing we see is because this is such a flashy industry and it's exciting to talk about and it is purpose driven and all those things are wonderful, but it also can be a shield from people looking more deeply and seeing what actually lies behind the beautiful graphics on the website or the flashy videos or the things like that. In this industry, like so many others, hardware speaks very, very loudly. And not only your flight hardware, but your factory hardware or your testing hardware, all those other things. I could not agree more with the comments that Terry and Lisa and everyone else have made about the value of getting lots and lots of testing, failing early, failing often. And it's hard to do that if you aren't trying to test. If you're either just caught in an endless analysis cycle, or you're so busy getting people hyped up that you aren't spending any time doing the work. So for us, what I always look is, well, show me your hardware, show me what you built, show me what your factory is, show me what your production rate is, show me how that's changed over time, show me how many tests you've done, when's your next test, when was your last test, where are you going with this? And that's, I think, when you look at a field like launch, which right now, it's hard to keep track of how many people are ostensibly doing it. I think it is well over 100. It's approaching 200 if you count every press release and Twitter account and everything else like that. Of those, 10 of them have real hardware. And of those, 5 of them have factories, aren't just putting everything into a Hail Mary effort for their first rocket. 5 of them are well capitalized enough or have the long-term enough vision to look at what comes next and what's rocket number 2 and what's rocket number 3 looking like. I'm not putting down the Hail Mary pass, by the way. It has worked in the past and it can work, but it's a pretty different thing from someone who's trying to do all of it above. So that's essentially where we are. We're gearing up for a launch number 2, but we've got rocket 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 already in the factory, and we've already fully capitalized that. And now we've got to execute. We got to do what a few of my other panelists have said. Now we've talked a pretty good talk, I think, and we've done the first steps of walking, but we gotta keep proving it out and stepping forward.
We're all going to be watching.
Thank you.
I think a couple of you have already talked about it, which is that this notion of advice to startups, which is, it's great that it's engineering focused, it's deep science focused, but marginal improvement really isn't enough. That they need to be creating and carving out new categories. Talk about some of these categories that you're excited about. And Sam, one of the things that I want to ask you is around things like Starlink, things around satellites and communication and the monetization of those opportunities. But for the rest, what are the categories that you would like to see or you're investing or you feel like haven't been addressed?
Well, one of the areas that are really is exciting for me is manufacturing in space. There's been a lot of other small satellites or launch. There's a lot of sectors in space that have been very popular, lots of entrants and stuff. But I think space manufacturing is something that hasn't had as much attention on it, but is pretty exciting. I'm working with a company right now called Varda. It's a startup, but I'm sure there's going to be others. But I think there's a lot of real revenue from that. The asteroid mining may be way in the future, but making something in space that's useful on Earth could potentially bring benefits. And the ISS has been a risk reduction. You can test these things out on the ISS before you put them into actual manufacturing. So space manufacturing for me is something that's really exciting. And another thing I want to say, because I think everybody needs to be aware of it, I think the risk and the danger of space debris is so important, and it's something that's not ever talked about, or it's rarely talked about. And I've talked to folks at the highest levels in government, and they all admit that this is really bad. Once you have the movie Gravity situation where you get cascading debris in space, that stuff's never coming down unless we have a startup that figures out how to remove randomly flying debris at 8 kilometers a second. So I think as an industry, And it's not just an American problem, it's a global problem. We really need to figure out how to not have space debris, because once that happens once, it's there forever. I had to maneuver the station to avoid the Chinese debris that they created back in 2007. So it's a real problem that I think we need to address.
Thank you for that, Terry. Any others?
For me, the biggest categories are, in terms of where a lot of my focus is on. One is in-space servicing. I mentioned Orbit Fab before. I think we are starting to see a ecosystem start to develop in space where it's not necessarily put it in space and then either throw it away when it runs out of fuel or put it into an orbit where it can add value. I think we are going to be able to see servicing as a part of the ecosystem. But a big part of my focus now is actually on companies that are dual use, so not just space. They're components or semiconductors or collaborative hardware platforms or software platforms that are focused and apply to the space systems and ecosystem, but also have applications in other industries like automotive or agriculture or mining. So we're really interested in multi-industry companies.
We're definitely seeing a lot of the opportunity with that multispectral, hyperspectral data that companies can bring back. It has so many applications. Also, so early in terms of that business model trickling down, where the financial firms understand that they can have an edge if they acquire this data, or the insurance companies who are actually quite creative and understanding that this data could be of value to them. So in terms of dual use, it's also the markets that are created beyond what you would expect. So we would hope to see in the next 20 years that any business in America has a space strategy and understands that space data could benefit their business in some way. Love the manufacturing sector that's for manufacturing things in space. There have been some new creative companies thinking about what can we do in microgravity? What can we build in microgravity that would be of value? And I think it's only a matter of time before some of the experiments that have happened in the R&D on the ISS expands into, individual companies like a Pfizer or a Merck that are going to be doing research on their own private stations. Of course, we're an investor in Axiom, so we expect to see more in-space manufacturing happen, but there are also the free flyer platforms as well that we expect to see that would be doing materials development autonomously. So it's not just sci-fi anymore.
Agree with everything that's said. I think the enabling technologies are always very interesting. So whether that's additive manufacturing, or I think something that's kind of, just getting underway and people are exploring the amazing possibilities, is generative design. And using deep learning to come up with creative and economical manufacturing designs there. And then back to what Matt said earlier, these cost declines are allowing kind of the promises from 20 years ago to potentially be realized today. And so, not being afraid of these big ideas that can actually be executed on with current unit economics.
Great. And just one point, Per Wimmer was with us, but for some reason he had some audio issues, but he's been with us in spirit. I want to thank our panel of experts, and I want to give it back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Scott.